I used to believe that silence was safety, that it wrapped around me like a blanket, heavy, familiar, and sometimes suffocating. I grew up in a home where love was something that had to be earned, and peace was as delicate as glass. If one person spoke too loudly, it shattered that. My earliest memory isn't of laughter, or birthdays, or sunlight, it's of whispers. My mother's voice, soft and careful, trying to calm my father's temper while I sat on the staircase, clutching a stuffed rabbit that had lost one ear. I remember tracing the cracks on the wall with my fingers, pretending they were rivers on a map, and wondering where they led. That I learned quickly that quietness kept me safe. So I became the quiet child, polite, obedient, invisible. Teachers praised me for being so calm, never knowing that silence was my armor, not my nature. There was always noise inside my head, though, a restless buzz of thoughts and fears. Every time I wanted to speak, I would swallow the words. Every feeling was folded neatly and tucked away like a letter I'd never send. When I was 10, my father left for 3 months for work, and my mother cried in the kitchen every night. I would tiptoe to her door and watch her shoulders shake, her face buried in her hands. Sometimes I wanted to hug her, but I was too afraid I'd make things worse. So I'd whisper from the hallway, "It's okay, Mama." But she never heard me. That was the first time I understood that love can be loud, and silence can still break your heart. Years went by, and my mother learned how to wear her sadness like a smile. She baked pies for neighbors, joined the church choir, and brushed my hair before school, humming softly. But I could see the fatigue in her eyes, that quiet kind of exhaustion that seeps into the soul, and I learned to disappear even more. By the time I turned 16, I had mastered the art of pretending. My report cards were perfect, my friends thought I was fine, and my mother called me her steady girl. But inside, I felt hollow. I was living a life built on whispers and unfinished sentences. The day everything changed was a Sunday morning in March. The house smelled like coffee and cinnamon, my mother's way of making the world feel gentle. She asked me to go to the market with her, but I said I had homework. I still remember her smile, small, tired, but full of love. By evening, the police came to the door. There had been an accident, a drunk driver, a rain-slick road, a heartbeat that didn't make it home. I didn't cry that night. I just sat in her room, staring at her hairbrush on the dresser and the cup of tea she never finished. The silence was no longer safety, it was a monster that swallowed me whole. For weeks, people came and went, casseroles, condolences, pitying eyes. I said thank you, I'm fine, she's in a better place. But inside, I was burning. I realized too late that I'd never told her how much I loved her, how much I needed her, how much I admired her for surviving the life she had. I'd waited too long to speak, and now there was no one left to listen. That was the moment I promised myself, never again would I stay silent out of fear, but promises are fragile things when made in pain. After my mother's funeral, life became a series of mechanical motions. People told me to take my time, as though grief had an expiration date, as though one day I would wake up and the ache would simply dissolve. But grief isn't a storm that passes, it's a climate you learn to live in. At first, I thought if I kept moving, I wouldn't drown. I graduated, packed my things, and moved into a tiny apartment 2 towns away, a place with thin walls, leaky faucets, and a single window that overlooked the city's gray skyline. It wasn't home, but it was quiet. Too quiet. The first night there, I sat on the floor, surrounded by unopened boxes, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of a clock I hadn't set. The world felt distant, like I was standing behind a glass wall, watching everyone else breathe. I used to talk to my mother in my head, "Are you proud of me?" I'd whisper before bed. Sometimes I'd pretend she was still alive, that if I just dialed her number, she'd answer with that familiar warmth, the smile in her voice. But all I ever got was silence, and the hollow click of a call that would never connect. I started working at a local bookstore. It was small, tucked between a laundromat and a flower shop. The owner, Mrs. Hanley, was a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and a voice that sounded like chamomile tea, soothing and a little weary. She never pried, never asked about my past. She just let me shelve books, brew coffee, and exist. For the first time, existing felt like enough, but grief has a strange way of disguising itself. It hides behind small talk, behind routine. I smiled when customers thanked me. I laughed when Mrs. Hanley told stories about her cat. But at night, when the world went still, I felt the emptiness rise again, heavy, endless, familiar, that I began keeping a journal, not to write poetry or reflection, but simply to talk, to someone, anyone. The pages became my confession box. I wrote letters to my mother that would never be sent, filled with all the words I never said when she was alive. I wish I'd asked how you really felt. I wish I'd hugged you longer that morning. I wish I hadn't stayed home that day. I filled notebook after notebook, until my drawers were crowded with pieces of my silence finally given form, and yet, even with the writing, something inside me stayed locked. That I went through the motions: work, laundry, meals, weekends alone. On the outside, I looked composed, maybe even peaceful. But beneath the surface, my heart felt like glass, transparent, fragile, one tremor away from shattering. People around me began to describe me in ways that made my stomach twist. You're so strong. So calm. So mature. They meant it as praise, but to me, it felt like a curse. They didn't see the girl who cried quietly in the shower because that was the only place her sobs could be mistaken for water. Months became years. Seasons changed. The city grew colder, or maybe it was just me. I started wearing my detachment like perfume, something subtle, but always present. I convinced myself I didn't need anyone. Then one afternoon, while restocking a shelf, a book slipped from my hand and landed at the feet of a stranger. He bent to pick it up, and when our eyes met, I felt something shift, not like lightning, not like love at first sight, but like recognition. As if some part of me had been waiting for this person without knowing why. His name was Caleb. He was a regular customer, though I'd never really noticed him before, quiet, thoughtful, the kind of man who read poetry without irony. He had eyes the color of late afternoon, that golden gray light that lingers before the world turns blue. "Are you okay?" he asked, handing me the book. That I nodded, maybe too quickly. "Yeah. Just clumsy today." He smiled, and it wasn't the kind of smile that demanded one back. It was patient, soft. "That's all right. Some days, even the world feels clumsy." I laughed, genuinely, unexpectedly. It was the first time in years that laughter didn't feel like something forced. After that day, Caleb started visiting more often. Sometimes he'd ask for book recommendations, other times he'd just browse and linger near the counter, chatting about things that didn't matter but somehow made the silence between words feel comfortable. That he never asked personal questions. He never tried to fix me. He just showed up, consistently, quietly, like a heartbeat I didn't know I'd been missing. That I didn't realize it at the time. But he was teaching me something, that not all silences are heavy, some are safe. Caleb became the quiet rhythm of my days. That he never demanded space. He simply fit into it, like sunlight slipping through half-drawn curtains. Sometimes he'd visit the bookstore and stay until closing, both of us lost in our own pages, saying nothing. But his presence filled the air in a way silence never had before. It was no longer the suffocating kind. It was warm, breathing, alive. We began taking walks after work, down streets lined with amber lights and the faint hum of traffic. I remember one evening when rain started to fall, soft and unhurried. I froze instinctively, as if afraid of something I couldn't name. Caleb looked back at me, his hair already damp, and smiled. "It's just rain, Delaney," he said gently. But I wasn't afraid of the rain. That I was afraid of the memory it carried. That night, that road, my mother's last breath echoing in a phone call I'll never forget. "I don't like storms," I admitted quietly. He didn't ask why. He just took off his jacket and held it over me, his arm brushing my shoulder, guiding me forward. "Then let's walk through it together," he said, and we did, step by step, through puddles that mirrored the city's lights, through the sound of water hitting pavement, through my trembling breath, until I realized that the sky had stopped crying, and so had I. After that night, something shifted inside me. It was as if the walls I had built for years began to soften, brick by brick. I started sharing small pieces of myself with Caleb, stories about my mother, my fears, my guilt. And he listened, not to respond, but to understand. One evening, while we sat on my balcony watching the sunset bleed into gold and violet, he said quietly, "You carry your heart like it's fragile glass, but I think it's more like stained glass. The light just needs the right angle to shine through." I didn't answer. I just looked at him, really looked at him, and realized that love didn't have to roar to be real. Sometimes it whispered. Sometimes it healed in silence. Days turned into months. We spent long weekends in small cafes, reading side by side, exchanging books instead of promises. He introduced me to his friends, his world, his laughter. Slowly, I began to believe in the idea of after loss, after fear, after silence. But healing is not linear. Some nights, I still dreamed of my mother, her voice fading in the rain, her hands slipping away. I would wake up shaking, gasping, the weight of all my unsaid words pressing against my chest. One night, I broke that I told Caleb everything, the guilt, the regret, the endless loop of what if that haunted me. He held my face between his hands and whispered, "You can't keep punishing yourself for surviving." And then, softer, "Your mother wouldn't want your love to end with her." Those words changed something. They didn't erase the pain, but they untied it, gently, like loosening a knot I'd carried too long. The next morning, I visited my mother's grave for the first time in years. It was early, dew still clung to the grass, the world still half asleep. I brought a cup of tea, the way she liked it, with too much sugar. I sat on the damp ground and talked to her, not in whispers this time, but in a steady, trembling voice. "I miss you," I said. "I'm sorry I stayed silent so long. I thought being strong meant pretending I was okay. But I'm learning now. I'm learning to live, to love, to speak." A breeze moved through the trees, carrying the scent of lilacs, her favorite flowers. For the first time, it didn't hurt. It felt like she was there, not gone, just transformed. When I left, I didn't feel empty. I felt light. That night, I wrote in my journal again, the same notebook I'd filled with letters to her. But this time, it wasn't an apology. It was gratitude. Years have passed since then. Caleb and I built a life together, quiet, imperfect, beautifully human. We still have our silences, but they're full of meaning now. Sometimes, we spend entire evenings saying nothing, yet understanding everything. I still work at the bookstore, though Mrs. Hanley retired and left it to me. The shelves smell of old paper and rain-soaked wood, and every now and then, I find a stranger standing where I once stood, lost, quiet, searching. I always smile and ask, "Would you like to sit for a while?" Because sometimes, kindness begins where conversation ends. When I look back, I realize I've become a mosaic of all my moments, the child who hid in silence, the daughter who mourned, the woman who learned to love again. I am no longer afraid of my voice or my vulnerability. My heart still carries its scars, but they no longer ache. They shimmer, proof that I survived myself. I still talk to my mother sometimes, in the spaces between day and night. I tell her about the bookstore, about Caleb, about how I finally learned to breathe without holding my breath, and maybe she already knows, maybe she's been listening all along, because now, when the wind moves through the open window, it sounds like her laughter, soft, familiar, eternal, and I smile, whispering into the quiet, "I'm okay now, Mama. I'm finally home." Epilogue. What silence taught me. Silence once felt like my prison. Now, it's my peace. I used to believe healing meant forgetting, but I've learned that healing is remembering, without breaking. I've learned that love doesn't have to be loud to be real. That strength isn't about never crying, but about daring to, and I've learned that sometimes, the most beautiful stories aren't the ones we plan, they're the ones that begin with loss, but end with light. I am Delaney, the girl who once hid behind silence, the woman who found her voice in the echo of grief, the soul who learned, finally, to breathe again. Caleb became my quiet place in a world that had never stopped echoing. He never tried to fix my silence or fill it. He simply sat beside it, like sunlight resting gently on a cold window. With him, I learned that not every silence is heavy, some are healing. Some mean I'm here. We spent many evenings in the little bookstore, surrounded by stories that weren't ours but somehow still understood us. Sometimes he would read aloud, his voice low and calm, and I would close my eyes and listen, letting every word soften the edges of my grief. One night, after he finished reading, he asked me softly, "Do you ever think about going back?" I hesitated. "Back where?" "To the things you ran from," he said. "To the places that still hurt." I looked at the shelves, at all the spines lined up like old secrets, and whispered, "I don't think I ran. I just stopped moving." He didn't argue. He reached for my hand instead, warm, steady, real, and said, "Then maybe it's time to take one step forward." It's strange, the way healing begins, not with grand epiphanies, but in quiet choices. Getting out of bed. Answering a message. Breathing through the ache instead of burying it. That night, I dreamed of my mother again. She was sitting by the window, sunlight on her face, humming that old tune she used to love. When she looked at me, she smiled, the kind of smile that carried forgiveness. I woke up crying, but for the first time, they weren't tears of pain. They were released. A week later, I went back to the town I'd left behind. The streets were smaller than I remembered. The air still smelled faintly of rain and lilacs, her favorite flowers. I walked to the cemetery, my steps uncertain but steady. Her headstone was simple, weathered by time, surrounded by soft green grass. I sat down beside it and just breathed. For a long while, I said nothing, not out of fear this time, but because I didn't need words. Eventually, I whispered, "Hi, Mom." And the wind moved through the trees like a response. That I told her everything, about the bookstore, about the loneliness, about Caleb. About how I'd spent years pretending to be strong because I thought that was the only way to honor her, but I was wrong, I said softly. You didn't want me to be strong. You wanted me to be happy. And in that stillness, I swear I felt her there, not as a ghost, but as warmth. As peace. Before I left, I placed a small daisy on her grave, the same flower she used to tuck behind my ear when I was little. And I promised her, and myself, that I would stop surviving and start living. When I returned home, the world looked different. The lights seemed kinder. The air, gentler. Even my reflection felt new, not healed, but healing. Caleb was waiting outside my building, sitting on the steps with 2 cups of coffee. When he saw me, he smiled in that quiet way of his, no questions, no expectations. Just presence. That I sat beside him, the late afternoon sun painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. For a moment, neither of us spoke. And then I said, "I think I'm ready." He turned to me. For what? To stop being afraid of what's gone. And to start trusting what's here. He didn't say anything. He just reached for my hand, and I let him. The world didn't suddenly fix itself that day. There were still moments when the past tugged at me, still nights when I woke up reaching for someone who wasn't there. But slowly, I began to fill those spaces with laughter, with words, with life. That I started taking photographs again, little things, the morning light through a window, raindrops clinging to leaves, people smiling over coffee. The world hadn't changed, I had. I was finally noticing the things worth staying for. Sometimes, I still visit my mother's grave. That I bring her tea, the way she liked it, too sweet and too warm. I tell her about my days, about how I'm learning to love again, not in spite of the pain, but because of it. And sometimes, when I walk back home, I catch the faintest scent of lilacs in the wind. I like to think it's her, reminding me that she's never really gone. Now, when I close my eyes, the silence that once suffocated me feels different. It's not empty anymore. It's full, of love, of memory, of everything I thought I'd lost but actually carried with me all along. That I'm no longer the girl who hides behind quiet. That I'm the woman who speaks softly, but with truth, the woman who loves deeply, but without fear, the woman who finally breathes, freely, completely, beautifully, and for the first time in my life, I am not just surviving. That I am living.